Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Early Thanksgiving. Hello there. Well, the turkeys have been demolished, the citadel of Thanksgiving feast has been stormed and left desolate, the big game has gone into the record book, and except for the feeling of discomfort, the holiday is about over. We look forward now, unless we happen to be a vacationing student or teacher, to the old routine of tomorrow, and thus it is always alas and alack, but fortunately so. The holidays come and go for us of the 20th century, and we eat our ways through them, toss off the bicarb, and take it as a matter of course. And for 48 years now, with reasonable regularity, the holiday flavor has been sweetened for some and made bitter by others by a score of football games, battled out players between our two big high schools, Aberdeen and Hoquiam. And we've suffered little collective pains, other than that of being the short end of the score. Yes, Thanksgiving touches us lightly here on Grays Harbor, except for the gastronomic features, and we rejoice in our blessings the American way, and give thanks in our respective personal manners, and forget the day until the next one comes. But it was not always so. There have been feasts on the autumn holiday on other years, when the thanks was real and profound, and as deep-seated as human emotion can possibly make it. There have been others when it passed almost unnoticed, this day of reverent thanksgiving that our forefathers conceived. So we are going to talk about some of them tonight, after Dick Crombie has the customary word from our sponsor. And Dick, a few words from our sponsor, please. Now, our first notes can hardly be called a Grays Harbor story, for it is not related that the participants in it ever set foot on the shores of Grays Harbor proper. Grays Harbor can't claim it as particularly its own Thanksgiving, but if we follow the lead string of our local history back far enough, we could run smack into it, for it's one of the earliest of records. It's the story of our first Thanksgiving along the Northern Pacific. If you remember your history, you'll recall that during the winter of 1803 and 1804, a party of white men, headed by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark, was heading west on the journey for the exploration of the country that they called the Oregon. President Thomas Jefferson had brought some land from France, and they wanted to get the idea of what they'd purchased. Captain Lewis didn't have much of an idea of what to take into the western wilderness, on such things as plenty of powder and ball, and of course a stock of salt and some medicine. But that was all about that he had on his list when President Jefferson obtained the counsel of woodsman named Andy Ellicott, who knew the western country, and the old frontiersman made out a list of things that would be essential to the land in the west of the Mississippi. And late in the 1800s, the party started out. They had planned to stay the winter in the Mississippi Valley, and they camped near the mouth of the Missouri, making their last preparation for jumping off into the wilderness. When the ice had broken, the winter was whipped, they launched their trek and away from the knowing world, which saw their backs as these men in their buckskins crossed the ridge against the sky and were lost in the endless forest of the unknown. Well, we're not going to explore the western wilderness with Lewis and Clark, but to briefly check up on them to make sure that they made the right way. Let's note that they made their way up the Missouri, across the state of Montana, climbed the Rockies and the Cascade, and followed the Snake River down to the Columbia River, then hence up towards the coast. And in November of 1805, they were paddling their canoes along the banks of the Columbia, not far from salt water. As they approached the mouth of the river, they spotted an Indian camp on the north bank and pulled their canoe alongshore near what is now the town of Chinook. Then just a spit near where the Columbia breaks out into the harbor's mouth. It was Wednesday, November 27th, 1805, and a heavy fall of cold rain swept the coastline before the southwest winds as they made their camp for the night. The next day, it was Thanksgiving 1805. For the first time in our history, white men, Americans, observed Thanksgiving on Washington soil. Now, it would be nice to relate that they held some kind of service of Thanksgiving in tradition of our people and feasted on a haunch of venison and other dozen of waterfowls or pheasants. That the warm sun of the late Indian summer smiled on the first Washington Thanksgiving. As I said, it would make a good story. But it didn't happen that way. As anyone knows who spent a Thanksgiving on the Washington coast, it would rain, threaten to rain, or just stop raining. And that was the condition. That is, it rained. A high wind from the sea prevented the boats from continuing as they had planned along the harbor mouth, so the men ran the canoes onto the bank and spent part of the day hunting and fishing. Throughout the day, the rain continued to fall, soaking the voyagers to their leathery skins. In their log, Captain Lewis described the situation as cheerless and uncomfortable. On this little neck of land, they wrote, we were exposed with a miserable covering that does not deserve the name of shelter, to the violence of wind. All of our bedding, our stores, as well as our bodies are completely wet. Our clothes are rotting with constant exposure. And that feast that we'd like to describe, there was no food except dried fish brought down from the Columbia Falls. The hunters returned hungry and drenched with rain, having seen neither deer nor elk, or have found a swan or brant to shy to bring to the approach. Then, wrote Captain Lewis, the wind shifted to the northwest and blew with such fury that many trees were blown down near us. The gale lasted all night and into the next morning. Huddled against their overturned canoes, the men were in the process of conquering the great wilderness as they observed Thanksgiving. And if there was a ceremony of thanks, it was not mentioned, though other things we know of them indicated that there were men who gave thanks for small things, amongst them for their secure passage through the uncharted world on a journey that had taken more than 2 years from civilization and would keep them another year before they might return. Well, that was Thanksgiving number 1. 1805. It is doubtful that there were many Thanksgivings in this wild western country during those early years, that only the Hudson Bay Company filled the needs for civilized contact. The lone trappers or the mysterious William O'Leary certainly held no festival of Thanksgiving here at this place called Grays Harbor, not at least until the settlers began to drift downriver and settle. And then, in the 1870s or the 1880s, that great American holiday began to gain a foothold. There was an observance of Thanksgiving at Westport, then called Patterson Point, about 1860. I recall Frank Peterson once saying, nothing elaborate, or more inspired by homesick soldiers stationed at the Fort Chehalis than an abundance of harvest. But it was not until the towns began to appear that Thanksgiving became an observed festivity. More often, the early day tables of the harbor were graced with geese and ducks than with the traditional turkey. Many of the trimmings were missed as capacities of local weather and soil and the available seed and plants started to limit the menu. But the thankfulness which inspired the first such festival on the bleak New England coast, the spirit of the day was observed. One of the first services in the old wooden church that served both Methodist and Congregationalist at one time in the late 1880s was a program of Thanksgiving. But as we might observe, we've spruced the ancient holiday up with our modern trimmings, and the program of modernization began around the turn of the century. By the 1890s, the few churches in the harbor's towns were all observing the day, and the festivities carried into the homes. And when, a few years later, someone got the inspiration to play the Aberdeen-Hoquiam football game on the special day, it was officially stamped as one of the most important days of the year for the harbor. It became a day that was made for many harborites with a score of football games, and the game from the beginning were played and replayed throughout the years fiercely as one mud of Herman's Field or the Electric Park, and today, perhaps as a commentary on this American way of life, Thanksgiving is more than a day of the big game on Grays Harbor, than a day for the giving of thanks for the feasting, as it was created by the settlers of Plymouth. And now, Dick, suppose you say a few words before we top this off for tonight. And since Thanksgiving is the day of the big game, and since we've made it that, let's review it in that light. What old-timer can look back on the procession of 46 games spread over 46 years and not recall that with a chuckle of some of the antics that the Aberdeen and Hoquiam did while playing in those games? There was the year that the Aberdeens built around a great Ira Blackwell, one of the greatest of the school's all-time players. The contest at Hoquiam was nip and tuck. Aberdeen had taken a game early in the season by a score of 15-0, and Hoquiam was out for revenge. The Hoquiam boys punched across the score and hung on to their 6-0 lead, despite pushing drives by Blackwell, who gained almost at will. Then, when the ball had been carried down almost to the Hoquiam goal line by the fullback's dynamic wallops, the quarterback, Ralph Faulkner, who had distinguished himself all season, thought to throw Hoquiam off stride with a quarterback sneak. Taking the ball himself, he was stopped cold. The chant of Aberdeen crowd that had been shouting, "Give the ball to Blackwell," faded to a moan as Hoquiam took over and won the game by the score of 6-0. There was the time the Hoquiam team, that is still recalled by Johnny Earhart's boys, the team that upset famed Lincoln High School in Portland in a contest at Old Herman's Field. Up from the south came the big, bruising Lincoln lads to register at the old Hoquiam Hotel and look tough. But Jimmy Earhart's boys took the field in fine fettle, and before the game was 3 minutes old, Boyer, Hoquiam's shifty left halfback, had grabbed a touchdown that Hoquiam protected all through the game to win 6-0. That was 1913, and Hoquiam was figured to have one of the finest teams. But remember what we said. You can never tell in these Thanksgiving tossles. When they came up against Aberdeen's pack of hustlers on Turkey Day, the blue and gold walked off with a 21-0 score. Yes, our modern Thanksgivings are more football than devotionals, but in the high tradition of keen competition that has been established between our two towns, we may have an ingredient that comes closer to building developing character than did old Pilgrim Fathers. And there is somehow a very real moment of thankfulness for home and country and all they represent, in a moment of quiet attention just preceding the kickoff in the big game, when the bands play the national anthem. So much for our hometown scrapbook. We'll be back tomorrow evening with a special edition that has to do with streetcars to Seattle. Thank you for listening.